Hello everyone, good evening. Before I forget, thank you to British Council and to Garage for inviting me to speak this evening. And on this quite interesting topic, Literature Without Borders, Cultural Leadership in Theory and Practice. So I've never actually spoken about in this way about what I do before. So I was really pleased when I got the invitation to come here and talk about it, because I think people consider literature to be an art form where the centre of it is one person on their own, working alone on a creative act, the writer, the author, the poet, maybe the scriptwriter. And that's true, but there's a lot more to literature, which people use literature in different ways. And people can be leaders in the literature sphere in different ways and from different positions. And there's some quite distinct ways in which you can create change in literature and through literature and by using it. And that's what I'll be talking about this evening. There's no monopoly on cultural leadership in literature. It's led by authors, of course, but it involves publishers and agents and editors, festival directors, curators, I could go on, of course, translators, and cultural managers. And all of those people contribute and work together to amplify and to select and to curate what messages get across and what defines the art form. So I'll talk a bit about the roles that I've played in publishing and also in cultural management, using some examples from Russia, but also from elsewhere where I've worked. And of course, at the end, if you want to ask any questions, please do, because it's a conversation. And I think, just to say what I think cultural leadership in literature is before we get going, is, for me, leadership in literature is about creating change, embodying change, and helping people speak. And that could be through live literature or in the written form. Helping their message get across in the way they want to get across, and also allowing a space for people to talk about books. And the particular thing about the art form, for me, is that, well, I agree with Nabokov, who wouldn't, but it's not really about ideas, it's about the art form itself, it's about the power of writing, and the fact that the work of reading happens in the head and of the reader. And it's a sort of dialogue between the author and the reader. And it's somewhere in that space that the power of literature, for me, comes, and what can be exploited from that. So that space between you reading the description of Anna Karenina's face, everyone will have a different picture in their head, to use a very simple example. But in fact, that's the beauty of it. It can be different things to different people and still maintain the beauty and the pleasure of the experience of reading. So I wanted to talk first and turn first to publishing and the written word, how it's written and how it's read and how it's produced and and the power in that and how that's sort of managed in some way. So I, as I was just talking about a moment ago before I came in, I lived in Cairo a few years ago, and in fact, a year ago, and I was there working in capacity for publisher. I looked after and founded, in fact, a new list, fiction list for Arab authors, writing about their experiences and about their lives in a new way, which they hadn't really had the opportunity to do, because in some way, in the environment of the Egyptian society, which was quite closed, it was a sort of police state atmosphere, in fact. Very few freedoms that one would take for granted here in Moscow or anywhere else. And we wanted to say, you don't get to have a second-tier publishing experience. You don't get to have a second-tier world. You should have the same editors, the same jackets, the same marketing, the same everything, the same opportunity as authors in the US or the UK or Russia or anywhere. And we wanted to elevate authors to a point where they weren't just speaking about their country. So, for example, we had authors from Sudan, from Libya, from Palestine, from Egypt, of course, from across the Middle East. And they weren't chosen, and our editorial team didn't choose them. We didn't choose them because they represented Sudanese writing or Egypt in some way. We chose them because they wrote great crime novels, or they had a completely different take using sci-fi to describe the recent revolution or counter-revolution that had happened. And they were doing it in a really exciting and brilliant way. And that was the most important thing. And that may seem normal or something to be expected everywhere, but that wasn't the case. And we wanted to also tell them, give them an opportunity to present their work to readers overseas, in the US and the UK mainly, in a way which challenged people's expectations and attracted readers, and we wanted to gather an audience for them. So these are 3 examples which I really liked. On the left is The Televangelist by an Egyptian, actually talk show host kind of guy called Ibrahim Issa, or Aissa, and he was sort of the Larry King of Egyptian TV, had a late night chat show, but he was also a really fantastic novelist, and he wrote about the power of a local speaker, if you will, at a mosque, who became embroiled, became a TV personality himself, and became embroiled in a political scandal. And he wrote a fantastic thriller. But Arabs don't write thrillers, or we're not told that they do, and that's not really important. What we want to do as a publishing house, as an imprint, as a new imprint, was to give him the opportunity to tell that story other places. And the book did very well. The one in the middle, by Khalid Khalifa, was a wonderful story set in Aleppo about a family who was torn apart whose lives were changed generation by generation by the violence in that city. And again, this struck a nerve in a way with readers outside of the Middle East, but we didn't present it in a patronizing way. It wasn't, you have to read about this terrible place. It was just written really well. And he did fantastically well with that book, and he was well-known-ish before, and he's better known now, I think. And the third one, Atarid, by Mohammed Rabi, he is an editor at an Egyptian publishing house, but writes the most horrific, horror, bloody, gory, sort of twisted dystopian descriptions of almost fantasy of what happened in Russia and the police and the army turning against the people. And we were able to bring those stories and him as an author, develop him as an author, and give him a chance. Now, I mention all of this because, let's go back here for a minute, for me, that's what part of publishing is about. It's to try and gather people, engaged, open-minded people in this case, around some authors and around some beautiful writing. The ideas come second, whether they're a Palestinian writer writing about something topical, or whether they're an Egyptian writer writing a fictional critique of the revolution, is secondary. First and foremost, you have to let authors speak. And that's all the more so in places like Cairo. Before I did that, I also I was one of the directors at the very beginning of the first 5 years, in fact, of a brilliant graphic novel publisher in London called Self-Made Hero. And I looked after 2 parts of this house, which was brilliant, is brilliant, it's fantastic. It's run by a woman called Emma Haley, who was UK Young Publisher of the Year, I think 2007. I was the director for marketing, but I was also the acquisitions editor, looking after acquiring all of the graphic novels from France, Germany, Italy, China, wherever. And there wasn't really a market, there wasn't really a place for any of these authors in the UK. We had to create it. We had to open up a space for them. Some of them very famous in France or in continental Europe, where the art form of comics or graphic novels had been long established, the ninth art, they call it in France. But in Britain, that wasn't the case. They needed to be championed, they needed to have someone on their side. And again, the publisher, in this case, us, we were able to do that for them. We were able to make sure that they got exactly what they needed. I'm going to show you just a few examples of that. So this is a guy called Frederick Peters, and from a story called Pachyderm, and in which it's very bizarre. I'm not going to tell you the story of the book, but anyway, this a corpse is waking up. But his books are sort of like short science fiction films in a way, and without people going out and advocating on your behalf, people won't read them, or they'll reach a very small audience. So we worked very hard to bring authors like this over to meet readers in person, to see them, to speak to them, to tell their stories, and to print their books beautifully, make sure they got covered in the press, and make sure they got talked about. And they did. Just a few more quick examples. This is Rebetiko by David Prudhomme, a French author, and he wrote about a small group of people called their musicals Rebetiki, the immigrant communities in Greece who were forced out of their work really and lived around smoking hashish and playing music. And I would really implore you to go and buy this graphic novel because it's brilliant. But again, you have to think of innovative ways to try and promote authors like this. And so at one festival called Latitude, which is a big music festival, we were given the great privilege of running a stage throughout the duration of the festival. And one of the performances we did was we flew over a band, a Rebetiko band from Greece and other places, in fact, brought them together and had the author do a live concert where he illustrated parts of the book with the band playing. And these kind of things are something that it created a buzz around the book, but it also said that this author was worth it, that he had done something special and he deserved to be right up there with authors getting coverage and getting listened to. And we knew that we had to bring people who listen to music at festivals to come and see this performance and become interested, and they did. And final example, actually one more. This is Kiki de Montparnasse by Catel and Bocquet. Again, I don't know if I've chosen another French author, but anyway, they're husband and wife, and they wrote a biography of Kiki de Montparnasse, who was the muse for many people, such as Man Ray and others. The interesting thing about this book and others that we commissioned, that we acquired at Self-Made Hero, was that they were non-fiction. And non-fiction graphic novels were even more rare than anything on the market other than poetry, maybe. And we managed to build a space in the market so that all the other big publishers wanted to do that. And now everyone publishes non-fiction graphic novels. They're very popular. And our life became much harder. But sometimes you have to do things first. And when you do, and you get there and you get the great authors, that's something special, really something special to do. And of course, there are fantastic publishers in Russia who do that as well. In fact, in graphic novels as well, Zangivar is one, Boom Kniga another, and of course, the big guys, Azbuka, Atticus. And this, does anyone recognize what that might be a scene from? Master and Margarita, yeah. So we commissioned this is actually a Polish author, husband and wife team who live in London. And this is the other side of the publishing house. I wanted to show this because this is us supporting and getting behind authors from our country and promoting them overseas. So Andrzej Komowski is a professor of illustration at the Royal College of Art, and his work, he was famous for doing posters in Poland when local versions of posters, and so things like Taxi Driver and Cigarettes and Coffee, Jim Jarmusch films. But he wanted to do more and more graphic novels and comics, and with our help and our support, Danusha and he produced a series of fantastic graphic novels that were licensed into other languages, and they built a whole new life producing these wonderful graphic novels. And this is another graphic novel I think you should go and have a look at. It's fantastic. So the publisher is the publisher is someone who is a position of where you lead. You work very closely with the author, but you also gather readers. I think that's the point that I want to make, is that this is something that the authors generally don't do themselves unless they're very proactive, and they're fantastic at blogging and tweeting and all things like this. There's something here about opening it up to people, opening up their work to people, and letting them experience the beauty of it, not the ideas within it, just the beauty of the writing, or the beauty, in this case, of the images. And that's something where it's most important, where, like with the Egyptian or the Libyan or the Palestinian authors, that they need access to something else, to other readers, or in this case, with the graphic novels, it's something that readers aren't used to in terms of format or image or text. At the moment, I have a wonderful job. I'm the CEO of Andrew Nurnberg Associates Moscow, which is there on the map. And there are offices all the way around the world, from Beijing and Taipei over here to, of course, Warsaw and Istanbul and others over in Europe. And the agent, I suppose, holds a very special place in the sort of publishing structure because, well, Andrew Nurnberg Associates is a bit different from other agencies because agents, I suppose you know, they're primary agents who look after authors on a one-to-one relationship, and then there's secondary agents who look after getting them published in other countries, and our agency does both. So the point of having all these offices is that each run by incredibly experienced literary agents can go out and talk to the publishers and create a kind of moment in publishing where something gets published all over the world at the same time. So whether that be Harry Potter or 50 Shades of Grey or something more serious, agents are the ones who really bring that together and bridge those gaps between the kind of commercial interests and the editorial interests of different publishers. So I think that I wish when I was at school someone had said to me, you could be a literary agent. I don't think I even knew what they were until I was sort of 25. And I certainly didn't know what a scout was. Put your hands up if you know what a scout does. They read the books. They have a set of clients around the world, one client in each language, territory, and they read a lot of books, and they write reports saying, before a book is published anywhere, to say, this book is incredible. You should translate it and publish it in your country. I don't think I knew what Scouts did until I was 30. I mean, I wish I had, because it's a great job. And agents and Scouts work together in a very kind of hidden way in the world of literature, where they create trends, they make superstars, they rumor, they gossip terribly, but they're only to certain people, and they're like a very special network of people. You may not even, there may be a Scout in this room, I don't know. You would never know, because they only talk to their client in one country. And if you ever get a chance to, if you're considering, you think you want to work in publishing, maybe you do, maybe, don't work in the industry at all. I give Scouting a go if you love reading, I think. You need to be able to read a lot of books, but it's a cool job. And they work sort of side by side with agents, but also apart from them. So it's a position of power. Agencies, we represent some Russian authors to get published overseas, people like Sergei Lukyanenko, Boris Akunin, the estates of Bulgakov, Vasily Grossman, I could go on. We have quite a few Russian authors, but we have authors from other countries as well, and many from the UK and the US, from historians to novelists and poets. And I find it a great privilege, and I found it a great privilege to move over to agenting because you're closest to the person who's on their own in the room writing. And you always have their best interest at heart. That's the only thing that makes the job, is that you've got their back. In the way that a publisher would say they did, but perhaps didn't, an agent would have to be 100% on their side, making sure they had enough money to write the next book. So, yeah, that's sort of the end of the writing for now in publishing. I love this quote from Sam Riviera. He was a poet who's published by Faber and other peoples in the UK. On stage at Bethnal Green Working Man's Club, I'm struck for the first time, and with some force, by the lunacy of transforming literature into a social activity. And this is true. This is really weird. I've organised a lot of literature festivals around the world and in Britain, and convinced authors, eye to eye, to go on stage and read their work. And they often hate doing it, and I always tell them it's a great thing to do. But it can be very... It doesn't really make much sense. It's not a performative art form, other than poetry can be, and some literature is designed to be read out loud. But it is a big part of cultural leadership in the literature sector, is British Council, of course, and the Institut Français and the Goethe, and of course Read Russia, take authors all over the world to try and do this in front of audiences who have no idea who they are, and read something from their work. But it gets to the point that there's some power in doing that, in talking about work and who writers are, and having your own opinion, and having your own creative power, and bringing it to a different place. So this is one thing I worked on. It did say Festival Grant in a lovely font, but it's gone now, so let's not dwell on that. I worked I curated a global festival of 20 writers who were named the best of young British novelists by Granta magazine, which is a very well-regarded literary magazine for new writing in the UK. And these 20 British writers, under a non-disclosure agreement, the British Council arranged a kind of world tour for them. And in fact, many of them came to Moscow. Ben Markovits, Tamina Anam, Helena Yemi, Ross Raisin, I think, came as well, Evie Wilde, Ned Bowman. And they all came. And we forced them to talk to people from... So Granta make this list of 20 best of young British novelists every 10 years. And we picked people from the previous list, very famous writers like Martin Amis, for example, and or Lawrence Norfolk, and asked them to go on stage with these quite new writers and talk about their work. And that's a very difficult thing to do, but something which I think has the power to, if it's hard for them, it has a huge power to inspire the audiences which they meet. And here in Moscow, there was events at Pashkov House and small intimate events as well. And lots of would-be writers, would-be publishers, in fact, as well, were inspired by seeing these authors, hearing them read and talk about their work. But it's not an easy thing to do for them. And in fact, I think it's actually a very difficult thing to make a festival which isn't just in one place. And I think it's something which should happen more and more. So you don't have one big week-long festival in, let's say, Hay-on-Wye, the very famous literature festival in England, or Edinburgh International Book Festival, where you set up tents and people come and they pay money and they go and see their favourite author. There's something interesting about bringing unknown writers. It's something challenging about it, that you have to admit that you're a reader. You have to sit down and say, I don't know who this person is, but I'm come here to listen to them, and hopefully it's free. And I'll be inspired possibly to write and make that leap from being a reader and coming in to be a writer. And I want to kind of move on to that a little bit now. One of the other publishers that I worked for did an interesting thing called the East London Comic Arts Festival. And the whole point of this festival, it brought artist collectives, writing collectives, print collectives from across the world, really, but mainly from Europe, and brought them together to sell their work, show their work in a nice, cool, it's an old boxing venue actually in East London that one was held in. But the idea around this was that there was workshops everywhere, workshops specifically for writing, workshops for making, workshops. We had a toy hacking workshop where there was big bags of toys and you were saws and glue and you could make your own monster. It was all about getting people to not be passive but to be active and not put writers on a pedestal, to break down the boundaries between writing and reading, between being in love with seeing a drawing and drawing yourself and understanding that it's a process, not a destination which is unachievable for you. But at the same time, I was doing that, and in fact, for a bit before that, I think this has most power when it's applied to children. And pop-up projects is, I was the chair of pop-up projects, which is a huge children's literary festival across the whole of the UK. This is Hervé Toulet and Michael Rosen. And these guys, well, especially Hervé actually, they brought exactly this ethos to their work when they brought to a festival. And I want to talk about this festival, of breaking down the boundary between writing and reading, between drawing and playing with paint and just having a picture book read to you. This festival was quite different from... I don't think I've seen any other festival like this. We basically arranged everything, but we gave each author, so Michael Rosen in this case, Hervé Toulet, and another 4 authors, money. We commissioned them to go and make their own stage, make their own... hire other authors, program their own stage, draw their own audience. And in the 6 weeks leading up to the festival, the public festival, it was free. This one was held in a park in the middle of London called Corham's Fields. We'd have schools programs where authors, maybe 30 or 40 authors, would go into schools all around, physically around the festival site, and work with children on specific projects, making huge dragons related to a book, or writing stories, or writing poetry, or reciting poetry, and they would bring this together and perform and show it at the festival. And there would be live interactions. Michael Rosen commissioned a jazz band to come and play, and he sang and got children involved in that way. Hervé produced these huge things behind him, which were in fact laid on the floor at first. And he would give directions over a megaphone to children to all do the same thing, one after the other, until they created this huge canvas, which was then strung around as a background for a stage, and then the event would begin. And each time, so Dylan Calder was the director of that festival, and it continues to be a wonderful guy. And we always went with the craziest ideas, the craziest schemes. But at the heart of it was a schools program. At the heart of it was community engagement, was family engagement, was working with leading up to the festival. And it was bring your dad, bring your brothers, bring your sisters to this big celebration, show them what you've done, and experience something different. And for me, that's really important. That was completely different from the way that other people were arranging children's festivals in the UK, in schools, talking to teachers, talking to children. There was actually a bit of a panic about, at that time when we were doing this, that should authors even go into schools, maybe they will do bad things, and they had to have police checks, a lot of police checks. And there was a real fear that this kind of thing couldn't really happen, that you couldn't have fun with kids, you couldn't let them play, you couldn't let them experiment with literature. But in fact, these festivals, and it happens every year, and they're getting bigger and bigger, meant that we showed that you could do it. And this is sort of the mission statement, I suppose, of pop-up projects. which we wrote, but we firmly believe that access for all children and families to the broadest range of published, live, and digital literature is a universal right. In all our work, we facilitate access to rich and meaningful literary experiences for children and young people, schools and communities, especially in diverse, isolated, and otherwise challenged communities. Everything we achieve through collaboration and partnership, working regionally, locally, and internationally. So it actually was about, it was a very cool group of people who put these festivals together, who continues to put them together, who believe that in the bigger sense of society that you live in, you have to be able to make a change in it somehow. And if you know about authors and literature and having fun, that's the way you've got to do it. You've got to say that access to this stuff has to be a right, and you're going to help that happen. So the next year of this festival wasn't in a park in the middle of London. It was a place called Canvey Island, which is sort of in Essex. It's kind of geographically isolated from the places around it because it's sort of an island and there's lots of industry there. And even the schools don't really talk to each other. And we repeated what we'd done in London and changed the ways that the schools talk to each other, changed the ways that the teachers talk to each other, made cooperation easier between them. And they had a great time. And it really meant a lot to us that this had happened. And so we went north after that, and we went to Ironbridge, and we had a series of, which is the birthplace of industry in the north of England, and it's famously called the birthplace of industry. And we went there and did the same thing. Schools all around the festival site, working up for a schools program, bringing the authors there, co-creating, not just reading, not just a reading program. The schools had to give up their normal curriculum for 6 weeks. So if they're learning Shakespeare, they have to get rid of the Shakespeare. They have to do exactly what we said for 6 weeks. They all signed an agreement, and they did it, and then they showed what they'd done at the end. And we felt with Pop-Up that this is a kind of action that locally becomes regional, and it did, becomes national. It's now a national festival. It's one of the Arts Council England's portfolio organisations, which means they get regular funding. And that's the kind of thing that then in some wider sense becomes international or helps contribute to making access to literature a universal right. And before I just stop talking about Pop-Up, I just want to say that there's no point getting involved in these kind of projects if you're not going to put all of your heart into them. Because, so they might as well have a really big aim, because otherwise you're wasting your time. And in fact, before I came in here, someone, I was asked what is the one thing, if you're working in literature or cultural sector, you shouldn't do. And I said, you shouldn't work for free. And I genuinely believe that. You should have a big idea and have big aims, and you also should make sure you get paid for it, because you're going to have to put everything into it if you're going to make a big difference. So, yeah. Okay, so, yeah, this is a funny quote. So Margaret Atwood, wanting to meet an author because you like his work is like wanting to meet a duck because you like pâté. I say this only because, I mean, joking aside, what is it that makes us want to meet authors? What is it that can happen when why do people keep wanting to meet authors? It's never going to be as good as their book, basically. And also, authors are terrified people. They're so scared. They don't ever talk to people, really. Some authors... one author, in fact, that came to Jasna Poljana last year when we did the Year of Language and Literature here, I said, what have you been doing? And she said, I've been sitting in my house, my flat in London, with industrial noise-protecting headphones on and earplugs inside the headphones, reading my book 30 times. And I said, did you do anything else? She said, I walked my dog. And that was it. And I said, how long have you been doing that for? She said, 6 months. And then you expect these people to come and sort of make like jovial conversation with people who say, "I love your work," and that's it. You know, and there's not they one person feels like they know you, and the other definitely doesn't. So it's often very awkward. But well, anyway, that's the starting point. That why is it? Why is it important? I mean, it shouldn't be. It doesn't make any sense. And to sort of bring that on, I once arranged for the British Council a festival in Iraq, a literary festival. And the idea of it was to bring Kurdish speakers, Kurdish writing and speaking authors, Arab Iraqi authors, and because it's a British Council, British authors, together to do a festival in Erbil in Kurdistan, in semi-autonomous Kurdistan in the north of Iraq. This was very difficult. I mean, Erbil, of course, is probably, you'll know it best because it's the place where the Yazidi Christians were persecuted and driven from their homes not so long ago. This is a sort of area where this was happening. And we arranged sessions in tea houses where there would be only men, because that's what tea houses are. And for the festival, they allowed women to come in, although there were no women's toilets. We had these. I mean, this is deliberately boring picture. I don't think this is an exciting picture, but it proves the point. This was as good as it got. This was the height of the festival, because before we arrived and we realised that they hadn't told anyone about the festival at all. Nobody. But they thought that was a good thing. They thought that was the best thing that could have ever happened. And in fact, the only seats were these 2 rows at the front, these big armchairs. That was it, in this huge hall. And these are members of the Iraqi and Kurdish writers' unions. And they were the only people who were meant to tell other people, but they didn't tell anyone. And that's a conference. That's not a festival. And if anyone has ever worked for the British Council or any other organisation like that, will know how that feels when you turn up somewhere and it's all gone terribly wrong. But if you've never been to a literary festival, you don't know what it's about. It was our fault. How would you know what you're meant to do? And there's some things you just don't mention, like there should be an audience, because that's what it is. It's people have to hear what's being said. And if we've brought an Arabic speaker, a Kurdish speaker, and an English speaker, and we have translation and interpretation booths, what's the point of that happening? Why would we have... Anyway, the point being, we had to go and get an audience. And when we did get an audience, there they are at the back. But when we couldn't get that happening, we actually took the authors and drove them to schools, high schools and universities, and just took over. And everyone was delighted. Well, they were anyway. The authors were terrified, but completely up for it. And it worked out really well in the end. And there were other things that you wouldn't expect around conversation and around space, around literature, which you had to force your way through. So, for example, there were poetry sessions where there were lots of... The students were absolutely delighted to try and be led by fantastic poets like Professor George Surtees, who is a wonderful award-winning translator and poet. Wonderful to have a session with him, but their own tutor would actually just step in and say, would answer all questions, and would say that he would write a poem which the class could then listen to. And it took everyone's efforts to remove him each time from the room, and other people in other sessions doing the same thing, and make sure that once this was lifted, this pressure, then everyone was writing poetry, reciting poetry. It was a wonderful moment. And that is something which I think, I mean, I'm biased because I work in the literature sector, so I think that's something that literature can do that theatre maybe can't, where there's a more passive reception of the art form, and unless there's a workshop around for actors or something like that. But I think literature has a certain freedom to it. Anything can happen. Things can go badly wrong on a very fundamental level, this being a good example. but then you can actually fix it because it's a very basic thing. It's like a machine that you can fix. It's an old-fashioned machine. It's very lightweight. You can move it around. It's just a way of interacting with people. And the next year, the festival was a huge success and has carried on to be. Maybe without my involvement, I don't know. But anyway, it was, lessons were learned. So a more successful festival was the UK-Russia Year of Language and Literature, 2016. And I'm just going to speak about that for a bit. In fact, I'm going to speak about that till the end. But this is, it's got a really boring title, Evaluation Report. Who would like this? But you can ask the British Council for this, to email it to you, or maybe they've got physical copies, I don't know. But it's actually quite a good read if you're interested in huge cultural relations work. This is like a £3 million project, and it went really well. And it went really well because of the ambition and the ability of the British Council team in Russia. And some of them are here tonight, so I have to say that. They were wonderful. And so it meant that they were up for anything. They brought incredible ideas, incredible projects, and they executed them like a crack team of commandos. They tried new formats of engaging with authors, gathering audiences, working offline, working online. And did anyone here, this is very embarrassing, did anyone here go to an event in the Year of Language and Literature? 4, no, a lot. For the cameras, everyone put their hand up. So yeah, as it says here, 89 authors, screenwriters, playwrights came. And actually that's not very many for the huge number of people it reached, 11 million people in the end, because we did things quite differently. I've written down some of the other things that happened there. But the main takeaway of it was that we had to. It was part of a big scheme where the same thing happened in the UK, and the Russian government arranged a similar program called the Russia-UK Year of Language and Literature in the same year, and did some wonderful things. But this is only about the stuff that happened here. And it had, because I've forgotten, 5 aims, to get young people involved in as many activities as possible, to celebrate both contemporary and classical literature, because it was a Shakespeare anniversary that year as well, to broaden appreciation of both Russian and English languages, and to create collaboration between cultural, educational, and economic institutions, and finally to inspire British and Russian people to find out more about each other's culture. So this is something that the British Council couldn't do alone. No, anyone could do it alone. They had to work with British partners. In fact, they worked with around 40... No, sorry, they worked with... I wrote this down. They worked with 90 Russian partners, over 35 British partners. I think there were 19 media partners, on a project that I'll talk about in just a moment. For example, there were 20 people from the British Council working on them, from places as different as London, Istanbul, Moscow. It was a very complicated project. It cost a lot, so everyone wanted to know everything that was happening. There were a lot of authors who were worried about coming to Russia. Some were delighted to come to Russia. Some were too delighted and had to be sort of kept close. It was a huge range of things. People who were totally fascinated to be here could barely concentrate on their events. Others who just wanted to stay there all day. This varied from huge set-piece events, like the UK being the guest of honour at the non-fiction book fair, to quite small events, seemingly small events, like translation exchanges between Russian and Scottish poets, which took place in Moscow and St. Petersburg. It was a reciprocal thing. They ended up in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And yeah, wow, the logo. That's any points for guessing who that is with his hands in the air? Ian McKellen. We brought people over like Sir Ian McKellen to talk about what had inspired them, and in terms of, he was a sort of Shakespeare master that year. There is his whole, it's quite funny because it's this image obviously, but it's just, I don't know why I chose that image. Anyway, and he went to Yekaterinburg, St. Petersburg, Moscow, and was able to talk about himself as a creative person and also about how literature had inspired him. And I think that's something which I haven't really done a lot of before, is getting someone extremely famous to just say how inspired they were by literature. And it had a profound effect on many people who saw him, whether that be here or in Yekaterinburg or in St. Petersburg. And when the British Council loves doing evaluations of things, and after, I've just written here in my notes that 85% of people thought it had changed their opinion about Britain, just seeing Sir Ian McKellen, which is quite, I mean, it's great. I mean, fame is something you can't put your finger on, and it's very difficult to get authors who are of a similar sort of level, who are not shy, who are outgoing, who will talk about anything and will engage and know how to be on stage. And so sometimes I feel literature borrows in its live form from actors and performers such as Sir Ian McKellen. But I think it's a bit cheating, but I think I agree with it entirely. So I wanted to speak a bit about doing festivals in different ways. So I said pop-up was quite different because we gave the authors a big lot of money and said, you go and decide what you're going to produce and commission. One of the projects in the Year of Language Literature was called Translit, and it was a festival that moved from, well, we gathered together some authors, a British author and poet, Joe Dunthorne, a Russian novelist, Elisa Geneva, a Welsh musician, Griff Rhys, and we also had a literary critic, Konstantin Milchin, and we had Nadia as well, who's in this picture. And we had them all together on a train, going from Moscow to Kazan, to Yekaterinburg, Novosibirsk, Krasnoyarsk, and ending up at Krasnoyarsk Book Festival. And in one sense, that's quite traditional, because in each place, here's Joe in Kazan, on stage, as a poet, in this case, reading his work to a group, to an audience. And that's fine. In fact, that in that group of in that audience, there were two complete fans of Joe's novel, Submarine. And they wanted a selfie with him, and they wanted him to sign their book. And this is good, traditional literature work. And this went on into different cities, and the same thing, but different each time. Was a sort of a little bit of Joe, a little bit of Andrew Dixon was the other author, who was a sort of journalist and an author who came along, and he spoke about Shakespeare. He'd written a book about Shakespeare and how Shakespeare travels around the world, and it's interpreted by different countries in different ways. But we wanted to do something different and something bigger. So just to go back, 1,000 people saw Joe and Andy and Kostya and Alisa perform at events. But at the same time, something else was happening in the background. We wanted to turn it outside, also on the train with the authors and with Griff, who would also play music at the events, were these people. Arseny in the middle, who's a fantastic videographer, Max on the left, a brilliant documentary photographer, and Fran here on your right, who is head of virtual reality at The Guardian. And she has a background in podcasting and soundscapes and documentaries. So they worked together. They were on the train the whole way, kind of snooping around, kind of spying, talking, listening a lot, being a bit creepy if you got up in the middle of the night and Arseny was standing with a video camera outside your coupe. This kind of thing for the whole journey from Moscow all the way to Krasnoyarsk, and then back to Moscow on a plane, and for a final performance. And they were there to create something much bigger. They were there to create a digital online project in Russia, which was just launching at that time. And they were there to create something that would make the festival much, much bigger. Because a video of Joe standing on stage in Kazan isn't very interesting, but perhaps Joe, as a poet, had responded to traveling through Russia in a way that it could work together with something else that Fran had experienced, listening to the trains pulling into the stations, or Kostya talking to Andy about writing, or Alyssa observing these strange British visitors and what they thought, or maybe even Griff deciding to write songs or music about the whole thing. So this is still online, of course, at inrussia.com. And it's a sort of multimedia experience about what happened. It combines the fantastic photography of Max Avdeyev, Arseny's videography, stories from Andrew Dixon, etc., etc., and all with a soundscape and digitally produced by Fran Panetta here. Sorry, on the previous slide. And this meant that people could appreciate it across Russia, but also outside of Russia. And I only have the information from here, from the last time it was here, but it had 12,000 people, actual individual people, had gone through this project, which we called The Storytellers, which was based on a Walter Benjamin essay, which quotes someone else saying that if someone has been on a journey, they have a story to tell, and talking about the connection between journeying and storytelling. And I'm very proud of this project and everyone who took part in it, of which there were many, many people, I think 20 or probably more than that, who actually worked on this digital project. Only a few of them were on the train, but they all contributed to making this thing. And I think that in this sense, this is a good model of a new type of festival where there is something quite traditional happening of people standing on stages, but you don't try and transform that into something genuinely interesting online. You make something new. You know, sometimes how they embed journalist units into military units to sort of show what's happening and report back on a particular war or something. It's like that, but with literature. Here is your traditional literature project, and then here is your embedded team, who in themselves are creators in their own right in different media. And they come together to produce something which is genuinely interesting to watch, actually fascinating. So, yeah, I think I always loved seeing things like this, and I was glad to do this in the Year of Language and Literature. So, I think I've said some things about how leadership. I don't think I've really talked much about leadership other than to say that you can do it from different positions. There isn't a job which is literature leader, or, you know, it doesn't make any sense. Authors are leaders in literature because they change opinions. Cultural managers are leaders in literature if they can create a space and hold open that space, whether that be in Iraq or in a physical space, or create that space, or whether it be in Novosibirsk at 8 o'clock in a wine bar, you know, making sure that everyone can hear the author and they share something. Or maybe it's, you know, in a more traditional publishing sense of opening pages and saying, we want your words on this paper, and we're going to take it to another country. Or giving an opportunity to a French, a German, a British, a Russian author, designer, illustrator, to talk, to write, to express themselves in some way, and giving them the best shot, fulfilling the full promise of being a publisher, to disseminate, to promote, and to keep going and to build their career and to build their work. That in itself is holding open space and gathering an audience around it. It's very important. And for anyone who doesn't work in literature at the moment and considers it to be a closed club, it is a closed club in one sense, because it requires you to have some education, to read, to have free time, to read, to write, maybe to talk to people. You have to be able to do lots of different things. You have to be social in some aspect. But you can do all those things. And if you pick something that you're good at and keep going at it, literature is quite forgiving. You will get there in the end because it's quite specialized. There's a part of literature and publishing for everyone. You may not be paid the most money. You'll make more money becoming a lawyer or something, but you'll be work with much nicer people, and you may make a difference to the world. So I think on that basis alone, one should try and make a difference through literature. And just to finish, I just want to say that I think at its best, literature and literature work is simple and personal and immediate, and it deals with dialogue and cooperation with people. And if you can achieve that on any scale, then you're doing something right and you're leading, and others should follow your example. So thank you. I have lots of Russian Instagram followers, but they are mainly concerned with manicures, and they work in Kazan, Yekaterinburg, Novosibirsk, and Krasnoyarsk. But if you are a genuine Instagram follower, please, that's my Instagram account,